Va bene, let's try this. I'm doing a review of two books about Italy. Or one book about Italy and one book that's more specifically just about Rome, 7 Sackings of Rome. I'm going to Italy, so I'm giving myself a cram course, a highly inexpert course on Italy. There's actually 3 books, which and the third book I've mentioned a couple of times, which is Christopher Duggan's The Force of Destiny, A History of Italy since 1796, which I bounced off of because as a noob, that book, which was like interweaving art, music, literature, architecture with the social things, and it was just weaving and it was super complex and super detailed and super, like, this is a book that once I've gone through a couple of other books, I can conceivably see myself going back to, well, actually I can't, but I'll get into that. That's got more to do with my interactions with history than anything. So I put that one down because I went, okay, that's not going to work for me. And I picked up, both The Pursuit of Italy, which is a history, which is by David Gilmour, which is a history of a land, its regions, and their people. And I also downloaded on audio Rome, Rome in a History in 7 Sackings by Matthew Kneale, which this is a 2018 book, which was narrated by Neil Garder. This is a 2011 book. Book from the library, both from the library, because I'm poor because I'm saving up to go to Italy, so yeah, interesting. This is definitely much more a historian, even though it's a popular history. It's still much more a historian and engaging with that. Where this is definitely it's written by a novelist, Matthew Kneale. Yeah, he's more known as a novelist. I'm going to put it down because it doesn't really help other than if I get it at just the right thing. I don't know if I can get it just the right thing. I'd have to turn off my lights to do it. But 7 Sackings, which is actually, it's got a great structure and kind of a thing to do because it's a history of one city, one little bit of Italy. You don't have to kind of branch out and try and encompass all of Italy. And boy, that's a difficulty. And we'll get into that later in a historical sense of getting all these disparate parts together. But yeah, so Kneale takes the idea of, okay, I'm going to tell the story of the city in 7 sackings, starting with the Gauls in 387 BC, going through Goths, Visigoths, Normans, the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V, other ones, and Nazi Germany, kind of finishing up with Nazi Germany in 1943. So from 387 BC to 1943 BC, with basically kind of saying that, well, getting into that, but so it gives you like the real strengths of this book is, it's super exciting because we're getting it at, bad times. Like these are when Rome is getting invaded, everyone's in trouble. And indeed the structure is, he'll open each section with, oh boy, here's Rome getting invaded. Oh my God. And then he'll back up and say, okay, well, what was Rome like at this point? And as he goes along, he'll say, well, the people back in 387 would have thought, wow, it's kind of sad how things are now in 410 or in 1084 or in 1527. And so giving a portrait of Rome at that time. So really giving you a sense of the passage of time, how things change so dramatically, from time to time, how Rome rises, and then there's like a lot of decline, and then rises, and then there's more decline, and then rises, and then there's more decline. So you really get that of the sense of this, the sense of it traveling with the city through history. And he's, as a novelist, he's really good at kind of dramatizing this stuff, and there's really, kind of cool characters. I think he has Buonvenito Cellini, who actually I read his Buonvenito's. This is like Renaissance, like 1527, I think, is when we're getting into Cellini, and I've read his contemporary his Cellini's autobiography, and it's a very rousing take it with a huge mound of salt kind of work, which is just very energetic. And Kneale does a really good job of capturing Benvenuto Cellini and saying, "Oh, I did this incredibly important thing." It's like, well, somebody did that. We don't really know if it was him, but he took credit for it because he's the guy, and he loves pumping himself up. So those are like, a lot of the strengths of like, I really got a sense of the place, and I really got a sense of the different, movements, and just all the layers and layers and layers of history there. If there's like weaknesses to the book, there's stuff like, well, we go from the Gauls in 387 BC to, I think it's the Visigoths in 410 AD, which you'll notice that's the jumping. That's a problem. Rome wasn't getting invaded when Rome was Imperial Rome, and Rome conquered the world and had expanded out so much that it kind of overcame its own, geographical frailties of Italy in general. So it was that really makes that's a bit of a gap, and he does yeoman's work to try and fill in all the stuff and kind of tell you about all the history. But it's like you can feel the structure kind of the structure kind of groaning under that. But all in all, it's like it's a fun, very kind of light work. I don't know how much of this stuff I take in, but it gave me a real fun kind of, I have a sense of the history and the layers of Rome. So yeah, I would highly recommend this as a light beginner's kind of a thing to have to get, and to just sort of have that sense of, wow, this is how much of Rome. And I mean, I'm sure you could write entire volumes on each one of these sections of Rome, but this was a great kind of just nice user-friendly bumpkin tourist with his his camera kind of thing of it. So from that, I think I would go on to here. Let me pop off all of my little notes that are more that, and go on to The Pursuit of Italy: A History of Its Lands, Its Regions, and Their People by David Gilmour. And while David Gilmour is a historian who's still writing it's a single volume history of Italy, which is, as he says, that's kind of an insane project in itself, but he wanted to kind of figure out a way to kind of just to get it into a single volume. And indeed, the first part of the book really goes through, kind of breaks things down, getting us up to speed to get into what is probably the key part of this book, which is the pursuit of Italy. And I mean, there's maybe like his own personal pursuit of Italy, but it's much more sort of the, it's much more of a, of the nationalist, maybe a pursuit of Italy, of trying to put this country together. There's a strong hinge in this book has got to be the unification of Italy, the Risorgimento. I'm going to just say Italian unification, so you don't have to listen to me butcher Italian. So he brings you up, like he starts off with the basics, like, the geography of Italy, the fractured geography of Italy, as he says. It's a country that doesn't actually really flow together well, that doesn't have long navigatable rivers. It's got a lot of things that are kind of against it for it to actually kind of unify, for it to kind of flow together as some sort of an easy, successful, just country as one country. The Italian peoples, kind of stressing the diversity. I think as someone who is looking at all of this from afar as a Canadian, I see, it's Italy, so it's just, they're all Italians and they're sort of all together, and you get this kind of monolith thing. And this, at the very beginning, he starts off by talking about all the different peoples that come in, and just how this all, and as we go along, of just like how much these are separate areas with their own separate histories and artistic movements, and just like how diverse they are, from a kind of more of a German, European, French kind of top to kind of the more this sort of the southern, and you get kind of Greek influence, and even kind of going over into kind of influences of kind of the continent of Africa at the bottom. So and then he goes into like kind of imperial Italy, and how kind of like with the Romans, they were, for that amount of time, to be able to kind of conquer all these limitations, basically by kind of expanding the borders out so far past Italy that they had control of, you know, they had control of the seas, they had control of the Mediterranean, they had a control of Europe, which actually is the only way that Italy itself could kind of not get continually invaded. And then, you know, that fell apart, and you get into fracture, kind of a, you know, very, you know, this is the fractured Italy. This is the city that it's like city states. It's like little regions, and it's, you know, all the constant, you know, you get little, you know, Venice, and you get all the invaders coming in and stuff like that. And that brings us up into what I think is the kind of the crux of this book, which is the Italian unification. So very much like his friend, which is funny because at the beginning of this book, he thanks his friends for, you know, their input in the text. And the top of the list of his friends for thanking is Christopher Duggan, who I mentioned just a moment ago, who wrote The Force of Destiny. So it's interesting that they obviously didn't feel like they were competing so strongly, because Duggan's book is like 2008 and this is 2011. They're definitely going for different audiences, and I can see why. Oh, I wouldn't have trouble, you know, helping good old David out with his book, even if they're best friends and he thought he was competing. It's like, no, I don't think they are competing. I think they're two different levels. If you're going to get through this book and then you're going to go, oh, I'm almost ready for Christopher Duggan. This is the end. This is if seven Rome and seven Sackings is the very entry. This is kind of the more the next level up, and then Christopher Duggan is like probably a next level up or a next level up after that. But yeah, so this is about very much the Italian unification, Risorgimento, and it's interesting. Even within that, you can get, you start digging through, and it's like, oh, he refers to a historian called Dennis Mack Smith, who is a English historian who, I think starting kind of like in the 1950s, started doing a revisionist look, because up until then, Italian unification was seen as sort of the liberation of Italy against its Austrian oppressors, and kind of a fairly simple story that way. And it's like, here's where Italy unified as a country. And someone like Dennis Mack Smith was much more of the opinion that it was more a series of civil wars that unified the country. And you can see that with the North and South divide, that there's very much this sense of, as I was reading this book, that you get the sense of North and South. As a Canadian, when I think of North and South and kind of resentments, I think of my American neighbors and the resentments between the North and the South there. And there very much feels like there's this sort of thing of the North sort of came in and kind of conquered and imposed their rule on the South, and made decisions for the South that the South didn't particularly enjoy. That the North resents the South because they think that the South is holding them back. And you get a lot of that. There's kind of things where, like, you know, there's things like the North thinks, oh, we're a part of Europe, and the South, some kind of rather, I don't know if it's kind of a racist thing but it's like, oh, that is a racist thing. I'm thinking, oh, well, you know, the South is sort of like, well, it's a part of Africa that we split off, you know, those kind of like nasty thoughts, but very much, so there's that, Dennis Mack Smith, as David Gilmour talks about in this book, is also talking about, you know, fascism there's a good question to Mussolini coming in like 1922, whether Mussolini was fascism an aberration within the kind of the glorious democratic unification of Italy, or was a sort of a logical, fascism ended up being a logical outcome of the failures of Italian unification. And indeed, you know, it's like, it was such a weakened state that they invited this fascist to come in to rule them. And he actually, I mean, you look at what the overturn of governments was at that point, and they were turning over like yearly, if not more, until Mussolini came in and took over and imposed this rule on them, imposed a rule which lasted, you know, until the end of the World War, with, you know, him being propped up by the Nazis at the end as one of the sackings. And then, you know, we go into stuff like them. So that's, you know, there's some good, I enjoyed this book because I like, okay, there's the kind of the popular history, but then there's like, oh, there's debates here, because it's very much like I'm talking like, this is Dennis Smith. This is, I believe Gilmour would kind of go along with this, these ideas that Italian unification was more of a thing of civil wars and you know, North maybe imposing on South and stuff like that but even if they do that, you can see that this is a debate, and there's Italian historians who disagree with this. There's like, you know, history is not facts a lot of times. There are facts in history, but there's also a lot of debate. And when you get into these debates, that's where I really feel like, oh, I'm getting into the history. This is where the argument is. This is where the argument is. And you know, stuff like, you know, is fascism, was that a sudden, like, was that an oddity? Was that a rupture? Or was that just a logical outcome of what came before it? And, you know, maybe it's not one or the other. Maybe Italian unification was, a part of Italian unification was, nationalism and getting things together. However, that seems to have really failed. And I mean, as we go along in the book, you know, I'm going to just pass from that and kind of try and move myself on to the end of the book and not do a plot summary of everything, because I just have this thing, even in a history book, I'm doing a plot summary, but just, we go through, after World War I. Oh, I should actually make a stop here, for the papacy, the Roman Church, because the Roman Church plays a big part. It was interesting what part that the Roman Church played in Italian unification, being very much against government, and indeed didn't want, if you were a Roman Catholic, you shouldn't be voting, you shouldn't become a politician until, like, you know, until the Christian Democrats, much later in the process. So they instead of being a unifying factor in this thing, they were very much an opponent. And indeed, when you looked at what the papal state was before this, they were a very repressive, anti-progressive regime. They didn't have streetlights. They didn't have vaccinations. They really kept their citizens down. They were not a democratic thing, and they were very much against that. Which, you know, maybe they had their reasons for, but, you know, it doesn't look that great from a Mr. Democratic point of view nowadays. But yeah, so then we get into, like, you know, the Cold War, which still had the influence of the church. You had the influence, which probably mostly importantly had, like, that influence of the church of starting to support the Christian Democrats, a party there. You get stuff like the Americans were very, very influential. You know, they talk about, Kneale was talking about, oh, you know, the 7 sackings of Rome. It's like, well, after that, there's the Marshall Plan, which is, like, you know, I assume as so totally or ignorant, like, you know, pumping the money into the country was actually a beneficial thing of getting the Italian economy going. And indeed, you know, while Italy as a state and as a unified country has a part of, you know, surprise from this book, Pursuit of Italy, it doesn't seem to have captured, Italians don't, from the sense of this book, I get very much sense of there's much the kind of the localism of Italians, and maybe, you know, the internationalism, the very strong supporters of something like the EU, but not really nationalism, not really, oh, we are Italians. You know, so let me just quickly, you get stuff like, you know, Berlusconi, who seems like actually a very Trumpian character, but if Trump owned all the media as well as, you know, instead of dismissing the media, Trump owned the media, just to put him that way, and probably about as honest and straightforward a fellow as, and, yeah, it was interesting reading about, I'm sure Italians have a lot of interesting views on someone like Trump and, you know, how he might remind them of Berlusconi in their past. But yeah, so, you know, in the end of the book, you know, it's like Gilmour's like, you know, Italy is a wonderful success, but just not as a national, as a national country. He's very much, I'm not going to read you the last paragraph of the book, but just the, you know, the idea that Italy is somewhere where, you know, individually, like, you know, the regions and stuff like that, they work. And I mean, each area has got its own history and culture and all that, which, you know, justifies itself as a country in itself. It's like, you know, greater culture than many just actual actual countries. I don't know if, it's one of these things of, I'm a Canadian, and I often think about, we have had kind of waves of nationalism. I am Canadian, and we do a lot of that because, we're right beside the United States, and we have a tendency to define ourselves by, there's a lot of it. It's like, well, we're not going to join the United States because we just get swallowed alive. We'd be the lambs to the slaughter there. So we keep ourselves as quasi separate as possible in whatever thing. So this Italian, it's because Canada as a country was sort of born in the 19th century as well. This settler colony was born there as its own individual country, and I think about that, whereas something like Italy is such an ancient, old culture with so many different various regions, but have a trouble to kind of unify themselves together. And Canada holds together a lot more loosely and has a lot less pressures on it. Doesn't seem to have as much trouble with kind of the government. It's just like the tortured kind of layers of government and stuff like that. I can see there is definitely a viewpoint in Italy where the state is very much an imposition. It's something that's not really going to look after them, the national state, where a lot more the local and familial is how that they maintain like what sounds like can be quite a lovely life. Like their standard of living is good, even if their productivity and just general national real runningness is not. And then I'm saying all this as somebody who's never visited Italy, and I'm going to visit Italy, so I'm hoping that all this will sort of it's the kind of book that I hope will prepare me for it. Now, that said, I whined about reading this book. I whined a lot about reading this book because it took me forever to read. Because I'm not, maybe this is me working on my muscles of reading, but I would read little sections, I would read little sections, I would read little sections, and it took me forever. And it's not a hugely long book. It is, it is like, about 400 pages long without the notes. And I started this. This is Nonfiction November, everybody. Nonfiction November is over. So it's I'm not super eager to pick up. I think I will look. I was talking about another video that I was reading, a book which was more of a kind of a group biography of 4 science fiction writers, but I zipped through that book very quick. And a part of that was that was a very well written book. I should say that David Gilmour, elegant, wonderful writer, marshalling his ideas, making it easy for a numbskull like myself, who's fairly ignorant, to be able to read it. Whereas something like Christopher Duggan, who also seemed like a really good writer, was writing a little bit above, was writing above my head, and so I had to put that down. So, yeah, so, I mean, I would highly recommend this. I would highly recommend this book, especially if you're someone who's interested in those kind of historical debates, because this book is it seems like to me a good entry passage into that, whereas something like Rome in 7 Sackings, also a good book, but definitely for more of a beginner level, I'm going to Rome and I kind of want to know what I'm looking at, and how, wow, a lot of modern Rome is definitely it's basically what the fascists, has been shaped heavily by the fascists, and indeed, apparently, I'll be looking around and I'll see, oh yeah, that's something from the fascist. That's fascist. They didn't pull stuff down. So, which is another interesting little thing in itself of yeah. Well, I won't go there at the moment. But yes, so that is my reviews of Rome, Rome in 7 Sackings. Rome in 7 Sackings, and The Pursuit of Italy by David Gilmour and by Matthew Kneale. So, yes, I'm sure as Italians, or anyone who with the knowledge of Italy, or Italians themselves, are going, die! I apologize, and my I didn't do that at the end. Okay, I'm stopping now. More videos later.